The wilderness is not a place of comfort. It is a vast, unyielding expanse where the air grows heavy with secrets, and the trees stand as silent sentinels to horrors no human eye was meant to witness. To be a fire lookout is to dwell in the liminal space between civilization and the unknown, perched in a creaking tower where the only companions are the wind's mournful howl and the shadows that shift beyond the glass. In the summer of 2013, three men, Samuel Hyo, Grant Calloway, and Avery Drayton, sought solace in the isolation of America's forests, fleeing personal demons in the Gila National Forest of New Mexico, the Bitterroot National Forest of Montana, and the Tioga Scenic Area of Pennsylvania. What they found was not peace but a descent into a darkness that clawed at their sanity and left them forever changed. Their stories, woven from the threads of solitude, fear, and discovery, reveal a truth as old as the land itself. The wild places of this country harbor terrors that hunger for those who linger too long in their embrace. Samuel Hyo was a man hollowed out by life. A divorce had stripped him of his home, his pride, and his sense of self, while a drinking habit had gnawed at what remained. By the summer of 2013, he was a husk, seeking refuge in the Gila National Forest of New Mexico, a wilderness of deep canyons, sharp cliffs, and pines that whispered secrets to the wind. His fire lookout tower, perched near Malin Baldy, was a relic of another era, its wooden frame creaking under the weight of storms, its windows rattling like chattering teeth. The roads to the tower were treacherous, rutted paths that even the Forest Service's battered trucks struggled to navigate. Supplies arrived by airdrop once a month, a parachute drifting down like a ghost against the bruised sky. A landline, prone to static, was his only tether to the outside world, alongside a pistol, heavy as regret, that he'd once used to end a rattlesnake's dance. Solitude was the job's currency, and Samuel paid it gladly. The wind, howling like a beast in its death throes on stormy nights, was a small price for the quiet he craved. The Gila was not a place for the faint of heart. Its canyons cut through the earth like wounds, their depths cloaked in shadow even at noon. The cliffs jutted upward, their faces scarred by time and weather, as if the land itself bore the marks of some ancient struggle. Samuel spent his days scanning the horizon for smoke, logging weather patterns in a battered notebook, and listening to the radio's occasional crackle. The routine was a balm, a way to stitch himself back together. But the forest had other plans. On a Wednesday in late summer, as the sun baked the pines to a shimmering green, Samuel spotted an anomaly. A thin gray line smudging the northwest horizon, faint as a pencil sketch. Smoke. He adjusted his binoculars, the lenses catching the glint of distant flames. He radioed the ranger station, his voice steady despite the prickle of unease. Tower 4 to base. Smoke sighted. Northwest quadrant. Near restricted zone. The response was immediate but curt, a voice stripped of warmth. Roger that, Tower 4. Stay put. No, good catch, Sam. No, keep an eye on it. Just static, buzzing like a swarm of unseen insects. Samuel frowned, chalking it up to a busy day at the station. But the silence lingered, heavy as the heat. By afternoon, the smoke had thickened into a column, rising like a dark prayer. Through his binoculars, Samuel watched flames lick through the pines, reducing them to blackened skeletons that swayed in the heat. The fire's behavior was wrong. No lightning storms had swept through in weeks, no campers were permitted in that sector, and no prescribed burns were on the schedule. He tried the radio again, his fingers tightening on the receiver. Tower 4 to base, fire spreading. Requesting status. Silence. He switched to the emergency landline, its dial tone a lifeline. It rang out into nothingness, each unanswered tone a needle in his spine. Anxiety crept in, a crawling sensation under his skin, like ants marching in lockstep. He told himself it was nothing, a glitch, a staffing issue, but the forest seemed to hold its breath, the usual chatter of birds and rustle of leaves replaced by a stillness that pressed against his eardrums. That night, Samuel stayed awake, his chair pulled close to the tower's windows. The fire's glow pulsed in the distance, casting an orange haze that seemed to writhe with intent. It didn't spread chaotically, as wildfires should, but moved with purpose, carving paths through the trees that suggested shapes. Angles, curves, patterns too deliberate for nature. Samuel rubbed his eyes, blaming too much coffee and too little sleep. Paranoia, he thought, was a fire lookout's oldest friend. But the shapes persisted, etched in flame and shadow, whispering of something deliberate, something watching. At dawn, the radio crackled to life, startling him from a half-doze. Tower 4, we're sending a team to investigate. Stay at your post. The voice was the same as before, monotone, devoid of the usual ranger banter. Samuel replied, "Understood." But his gut twisted, a knot of instinct that refused to loosen. Around mid-morning, he spotted movement below. Two men hiking up the dirt path toward his tower, dressed in fire-resistant gear that gleamed faintly in the sunlight. They carried no helmets, no radios, no firefighting tools. Just backpacks slung low, their straps cutting into their shoulders. Their stride was too purposeful, too synchronized, like predators closing on a scent. Samuel stepped onto the tower's narrow deck, his boots scuffing the weathered wood. "You the lookout?" the shorter man called, his face tanned and leathery, his smile a slash that didn't touch his voice. Samuel nodded, his hand resting near the pistol holstered at his hip. "That's me. You guys from the station?" The taller man, his features sharp as a blade, tilted his head. "Not exactly," he said, his voice smooth as oil, practiced in a way that set Samuel's teeth on edge. "Contractors, here to assess the situation." Samuel's gut screamed. The Forest Service didn't outsource fire response, not in his 3 months on the job, not in any story he'd heard from veteran lookouts. "Got credentials?" he asked, keeping his tone light, his eyes flicking to their empty hands. The shorter man waved a hand, dismissive. "No need to worry. We've got it under control. You just stay here." The words were a command, not a suggestion, and they hung in the air like a threat. Samuel nodded, retreating into the tower, but as soon as the men turned toward the forest, he grabbed his binoculars. They weren't heading for the fire's heart, where the flames still flickered. They were veering toward the restricted zone on his maps, an area marked with a red X, which he'd always assumed hid old mining claims or unstable terrain. Now, watching their deliberate path, he wasn't so sure. By late afternoon, the men had disappeared into the dense pines, swallowed by the forest's green maw. Samuel's unease had blossomed into a full-blown dread, a weight that pressed against his chest. He considered driving to the ranger station, but his truck was a temperamental beast, its engine coughing at the best of times. Abandoning his post was grounds for termination, and Samuel needed the job, needed the solitude, the chance to rebuild. Instead, he kept his binoculars trained on the restricted zone, his eyes burning from the strain. The fire's glow dimmed as the sun sank, casting the forest in a twilight that seemed to pulse with malice. When the men emerged at sunset, Samuel's breath caught. They carried something, a burden slung over the taller man's shoulder. Through the binoculars, he saw it clearly. A man, or what was left of one, his head lolling at an impossible angle, his chest a mess of red and white, ribs glinting in the fading light. The body was limp, its limbs dangling like a broken puppet's. Samuel dropped the binoculars, his hands trembling as he fumbled for the pistol. The logical part of his mind screamed to stay hidden, to lock the door and wait for morning. But instinct was louder, a primal urge to know, to understand what he'd stumbled into. He crept down the tower stairs, moving as quietly as the creaking would allow, the pistol a cold weight in his hand. The men were almost out of sight, heading toward a dirt track that shouldn't have existed, a path not marked on any map. A plateless pickup truck waited there, its bed cloaked in shadow. Samuel followed, sticking to the trees, his boots sinking into the soft earth. The men dumped the body into the truck's bed with a casual brutality, like tossing a sack of grain. They climbed in and drove off, leaving a plume of dust that shimmered in the moonlight. Samuel should have turned back. He should have radioed the station, hiked out, done anything but what he did next. But fear and curiosity are cruel masters, and they drove him toward the restricted zone. The trail was overgrown, thorns snagging his jacket, branches clawing at his face. The air grew heavier, thick with the scent of damp earth and something sharper, metallic. After 2 miles, he reached a clearing where the earth was scorched black, as if kissed by a flame older than the forest itself. At its center lay a metal hatch, half buried under debris, its surface pitted with rust. The air reeked of burnt chemicals and rot, a stench that coated Samuel's throat. He approached the hatch, his heart pounding a rhythm of retreat. The padlock was old, its metal flaking under his touch. One stomp, and it snapped open, the sound echoing like a gunshot in the silence. The hatch creaked as he lifted it, revealing a ladder descending into darkness. Samuel told himself he'd only go far enough to see, a quick glance to confirm his suspicions before reporting to the authorities. But curiosity is a leash, and it pulled him downward. The ladder was cold, its rungs slick with condensation. At the bottom, a concrete corridor stretched forward, lit by flickering fluorescent lights that buzzed like dying insects. The walls were stained with oily blackness, streaks that seemed to pulse in the dim glow. The air was colder here, thick with the stench of decay, a rancid sweetness that made Samuel's stomach lurch. He moved forward, his boots scuffing the concrete, each step amplifying his sense of trespass. The first room he found was a lab, its tables lined with vials, jars, and surgical tools, their blades glinting under the flickering lights. A metal table stood in the corner, its surface scarred, its restraints crusted with something dark and flaking, blood, long dried. Samuel's breath hitched, his mind racing to piece together the scene. This was no abandoned mine. Further down the corridor, he found a storage room, its walls lined with metal barrels, each labeled with cryptic codes, letters and numbers that meant nothing to him. He pried one open, the lid groaning in protest. The stench hit him like a physical blow, a wave of rot that nearly knocked him over. Inside, a viscous yellowish fluid held a grotesque cargo. Human limbs, arms, legs, torsos, hacked apart and floating like specimens in a madman's collection. Samuel staggered back, bile rising in his throat. He choked on the air, his vision swimming. Footsteps echoed, heavy and deliberate, from deeper within the bunker. Not his own, but something or someone else moving with purpose. Samuel froze, his heart a drumbeat in his chest. He ducked behind a stack of barrels, the metal cold against his back. The footsteps grew louder, closer, accompanied by the faint rasp of breathing. A shadow fell across the doorway, and Samuel caught a glimpse of the shorter man from earlier. He held a machete, its blade smeared with something dark, its edge catching the fluorescent light. The man stopped, sniffing the air like a hound, his head tilting as if sensing an intruder. Samuel's hand tightened around the pistol, his knuckles white, but he didn't dare move. After an eternity, the man turned and walked away, his footsteps fading into the bunker's depths. Samuel bolted, sprinting down the corridor, up the ladder, and into the forest, not caring how much noise he made. The night air was a shock, cold and clean, but it couldn't wash away the stench clinging to his skin. He reached the tower, his lungs burning, and locked the door, shoving a cabinet against it for good measure. He collapsed into a chair, the pistol trembling in his hands, and sat there for hours, staring at the door, waiting for it to burst open. The forest was silent, the fire's glow gone, as if it had never been. At dawn, Samuel ventured outside. The forest was eerily quiet, the usual bird calls absent. He scanned the horizon with his binoculars, but the men and their truck were gone. The hatch remained, a dark scar in the clearing, its presence a taunt. Samuel made his decision. He packed his gear, left a note in the radio log, investigate restricted zone, possible crime scene, and hiked 2 days to the nearest town. The authorities listened, their faces unreadable, and promised to investigate. Weeks later, the Forest Service called, their tone clipped. The area was restricted for hazardous materials testing, they said. Samuel had misinterpreted what he saw. No mention of the bunker, the barrels, the body. Months passed, but the images lingered, limbs floating in yellow fluid, a machete's smeared blade. Years later, a friend in the Forest Service, his voice low over a crackling phone line, told Samuel the truth. The shorter man was Carlton Doofus, a former biologist turned black market organ harvester. The bunker was his base, hidden under the guise of government testing, targeting vagrants, loners, anyone who wouldn't be missed. The fire was a cover to erase evidence. Doofus was never caught, his shadow slipping into the wild. Samuel lies awake some nights, wondering how close he came to joining those barrels, his life reduced to a code on a metal drum. Grant Calloway was no stranger to ruin. A divorce had left him with nothing but a suitcase and a drinking habit that clung like damp rot. By 2017, he was 3 months into a fire lookout stint in Montana's Bitterroot National Forest, a place where the mountains rose like jagged teeth against the sky. His tower, perched on a ridge called Burnt Hollow, was a 2-hour hike from the nearest road, a solitary outpost reachable only by a mule team that delivered supplies every few weeks. The tower was a Spartan affair. Wooden walls weathered to gray, a hand-crank radio that sputtered like an old man's cough, and windows that rattled in the wind. Grant's days were a ritual of scanning the horizon for smoke, logging weather in a spiral notebook, and shooing squirrels that taunted him from the rafters. Nights were heavier, the silence sinking into his bones, amplifying every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves. Burnt Hollow was not a place for lingering. The ridge was named for a fire decades ago that had left scars on the earth, patches of barren soil where nothing grew. The forest below was dense, its pines crowding together like mourners at a funeral, their needles carpeting the ground in a hush. Grant liked the isolation, or so he told himself. It was a chance to rebuild, to shake off the ghosts of Missoula. Bar fights, unpaid bills, a wife who'd stopped loving him long before the papers were signed. But the forest had a way of peeling back your defenses, exposing the raw nerves beneath. On a clear day in late summer, as Grant brewed coffee over a propane stove, he spotted movement a mile down the slope. Through his binoculars, he saw a figure weaving through the trees. Tall, lean, dressed in a tattered jacket that might have been green once but was now a patchwork of mud and grime. The man moved upright, not like a deer or elk, but with a purpose that set Grant's nerves on edge. At first, he thought it was a hiker, though the area was far from any designated trail. Then he saw the object slung across the man's back. Not a hiking pole, but a machete, its blade glinting in the sunlight. Grant's pulse quickened. "What the hell?" he muttered, lowering the binoculars. He radioed the ranger station, his voice calm despite the tightening in his chest. "Tower 27 to base. Got a lone male, armed, moving toward the tower." The response was faint, static-laced. "Copy, Tower 27. No patrols nearby. Keep watch." Grant frowned, his fingers drumming on the radio. Hikers didn't carry machetes, not like that. He grabbed a hatchet from a hook by the door, the closest thing to a weapon he had, and laid it on the table, its blade catching the light. Just in case. By late afternoon, the man was close enough to hear, his boots crunching on the gravel path leading to the tower. Grant stepped onto the deck, leaning over the railing, trying to project authority he didn't feel. "Hey there, this is a restricted area," he called. "You lost." The man stopped, tilting his head to look up. His face was gaunt, his beard scraggly, his eyes sunken in a way that made Grant's skin crawl. "Not lost," he rasped, his voice like dry leaves. "Looking for something." Grant's grip tightened on the railing. "You won't find it here. Best head back to the trail." The man didn't move. Instead, he unslung the machete, tapping its flat against his palm. "You sure about that?" he asked, his lips curling into a grin that was all teeth, no warmth. Grant backed into the tower, locking the door with a trembling hand. He cranked the radio, his voice shaking. "Tower 27 to base. Got an uninvited guest, armed with a machete. Requesting assistance." Static, then a faint reply. Copy Tower 27. Closest rangers 2 hours out. Hold tight. 2 hours. Grant's stomach sank. The man was already climbing the stairs, the wood creaking under his weight. Grant positioned himself by the door, hatchet in hand, his mind racing. Could he scare the man off? Could he swing the hatchet if it came to that? The man reached the landing, his face level with the windows. For a moment, they stared at each other through the glass, the man's grin widening. Then he raised the machete and smashed it against the window. The first blow cracked the glass. The second sent shards flying inward. "Get out of here!" Grant shouted, brandishing the hatchet. "I'll use this." The man laughed, a dry, humorless sound. "Oh, I'm counting on it," he said, stepping through the shattered window. The next moments were a blur of adrenaline and terror. The man lunged, machete swinging, and Grant sidestepped, the blade splintering the table's edge. Grant swung the hatchet wildly, missing by inches. The man kicked a chair, knocking Grant off balance, and he went down hard, his back slamming into the wall. The man loomed over him, machete raised. "You look like you've had a good life," he said, his voice thick with menace. "Shame it's about to end." Grant kicked out, catching the man's knee. The man stumbled, and Grant scrambled up, swinging the hatchet with everything he had. The blade bit into the man's shoulder, blood spraying across the floor. The man screamed, a guttural, animalistic sound, clutching the wound. Grant grabbed the radio and bolted out the door, leaping the last few steps to the ground. He ran into the woods, branches whipping his face, the man's ragged breaths echoing behind him. "You can run, but you can't hide," the man shouted, crashing through the underbrush. Grant veered toward a dry creek bed, sliding down the embankment and crouching behind a fallen log. His lungs burned, his heart hammering. The forest fell silent, save for the man's taunts. "You think you're clever? This is my world, not yours." Grant peeked over the log, seeing the man's bloody jacket, his shoulder dripping red. The man moved with a predator's intent, scanning the shadows with a twisted smile. "I'll find you," he sang, "and we'll see how sharp that little hatchet is." Grant waited until the man passed, then crept back to the tower, his plan desperate but clear. Grab the flare gun and signal for help. As he reached the ridge, he stumbled over something that stopped his breath. A body, a Forest Service ranger, his uniform torn, limbs bent at unnatural angles, the ground dark with dried blood. Grant bit back nausea, forcing himself to move. The tower loomed ahead, a beacon of fragile safety. He sprinted inside, bolting the door and grabbing the flare gun from its case. Footsteps echoed on the stairs, the man's voice mockingly sweet. "Grant, come on out. Let's finish this." Grant aimed the flare gun at the door, his finger trembling. "Go to hell," he muttered, firing. The flare exploded outward, igniting the door frame. The man yelped, and the smell of burning wood filled the air. Grant shoved his backpack through the broken window and climbed out, the drop jarring his knees. Behind him, the tower crackled, smoke billowing into the sky. He ran until his legs gave out, collapsing near the creek bed, watching the flames consume the tower. Sirens wailed in the distance, rangers finally arriving. They found no sign of the man, but near the creek bed, they discovered a makeshift campsite littered with human bones and journals detailing a drifter named Lars Mikkelsen, a hunter of men who'd lived off the grid for a decade, preying on hikers and hunters. 6 victims' remains were recovered, but Mikkelsen was gone. Perhaps burned in the fire, perhaps vanished into the wilderness. Grant never returned to a lookout post, the forest's silence no longer a refuge but a warning. Avery Drayton was tired of people, not in a hateful way, but in the bone-deep exhaustion of constant disappointment. Friends who betrayed, lovers who lied, family who judged, each had chipped away at his faith in humanity. In 2013, he took a fire lookout job in Pennsylvania's Tioga Scenic Area, an 80-foot tower perched on a ridge overlooking miles of dense forest. The tower was a creaking relic, its metal stairs groaning underfoot, its cabin barely big enough for a cot, a propane stove, and a desk cluttered with binoculars and a radio. The solitude was a gift, a chance to live without the weight of others' expectations. Most days it was quiet, peaceful, the forest stretching out like a green sea, manageable from his perch. Nights were lit by a camping lantern, its glow soft against the pages of battered paperbacks. The Tioga Forest was a labyrinth of oak and pine, its trails winding through shadows that seemed to shift when you weren't looking. Avery's routine was simple. Morning scans for smoke, afternoon logs of wind and temperature, evenings lost in novels. The radio crackled only when the ranger station had something to say, usually mundane updates about trail conditions. 5 weeks in, he'd settled into the rhythm, the forest's hum a counterpoint to his thoughts. But on a warm afternoon, as sunlight dappled the forest floor, he spotted movement 3 clicks north. A man stumbling through the trees, clothes torn, hair wild, moving with a frantic urgency. Avery grabbed the radio, his voice steady. "Ranger Station, this is Drayton. Got a guy 3 clicks north of my position. Looks in bad shape." The reply was prompt. "Go ahead, Drayton. No teams in that area. Keep an eye on him." Avery trained his binoculars, watching the man disappear into a thicket of pine. Something about his movements, jerky, desperate, made Avery's skin crawl. He wasn't running for exercise or because he was lost. He was running from something. An hour later, as the sun dipped lower, the man reappeared, closer to the tower's base. He stopped, looking over his shoulder, scanning the trees like a hunted animal. His face was pale, his eyes wide with terror. Avery leaned over the railing, shouting, "Hey, you all right?" The man jerked his head up, startled, but didn't answer. He bolted into the underbrush, swallowed by the forest. Avery's pulse quickened. Before he could radio again, he saw them, 2 figures emerging 50 yards behind where the man had been. They were bigger, bulkier, dressed in dark clothing too heavy for the warm weather. One carried a rifle slung over his shoulder, its barrel catching the fading light. Avery grabbed the radio. "Ranger Station, we've got a situation. 2 armed individuals moving north, tracking someone." The dispatcher's voice was sharper now. "Copy, Drayton. Stay put and keep eyes on them. We'll alert local authorities." Avery followed the men with his binoculars until they vanished into the trees, their movements deliberate, predatory. The forest fell silent, even the crickets hesitant to sing. Avery tried to focus on his logbook, but every creak of the tower made him jump, his nerves frayed like old rope. At 8 p.m., as the last streaks of daylight bled from the sky, a voice pierced the silence from below. "Help! Please help me!" Avery grabbed his flashlight, its beam cutting through the darkness. The man from earlier stood at the tower's base, waving his arms, his face streaked with dirt and sweat. "What's going on?" Avery shouted. "Who's after you? They're going to kill me," the man yelled. "Please, let me up," against every instinct screaming to stay out of it. Avery lowered the ladder. The man, Callum, he said his name was, scrambled up, collapsing onto the platform, gasping for air. "Who are you?" Avery asked, keeping his distance, his hand near the rusty bolt-action rifle issued to him. "What's happening?" Callum's voice was ragged. "My name's Callum. I was hiking near the river this morning when I stumbled onto something. These guys, they're not normal hunters. They killed someone, were cutting them up. I ran. They saw me." Avery's stomach turned. "You're saying there are killers in the woods?" Callum nodded, his hands trembling. "They're not going to stop until they find me." Avery radioed the station, relaying Callum's story. The dispatcher's voice was calm but strained. "Law enforcement's en route, but it'll be hours. Stay secure. Hours." Avery glanced at Callum, pacing nervously, muttering to himself. The forest below was a black void, the only light from Avery's flashlight and the lantern's dim glow. He kept the rifle within reach, its weight a cold comfort. Around midnight, a faint noise broke the silence. The crunch of leaves, the snap of a twig. Callum froze, his eyes darting to the platform's edge. Avery killed the lantern, peering into the darkness. 2 flashlight beams bobbed through the trees, closing in. "They're here," Callum whispered, his voice barely audible. The beams grew closer, accompanied by muffled voices, sharp and aggressive. Avery chambered around, bracing himself. A deep voice called from below. "We know you're up there. Come down and we'll make this quick." Avery hissed at Callum to stay quiet. The men started climbing the ladder, their boots heavy on the metal rungs. Avery aimed the rifle at the opening. "Stop right there or I'll shoot." The men paused, but the voice replied, cold and certain. "You don't want to get involved. Hand him over and we'll leave you alone." Callum gripped Avery's arm, pleading, "Don't let them take me." Avery fired a warning shot into the air, the sound deafening in the stillness. The men retreated down the ladder but lingered below, their flashlights flickering like malevolent eyes. "You're making a mistake," one shouted. Avery and Callum stayed in the tower all night, barely speaking, the men's presence a constant threat. At dawn, a helicopter's roar shattered the tension. Avery waved an orange flag, and within minutes, rangers and state troopers swarmed the area. The men were found hiding less than a mile away, armed with hunting knives, rope, and plastic sheeting, tools of a grim trade. Near the river, authorities discovered a shallow grave with human remains, confirming Callum's story. The men were part of a small, notorious organ trafficking ring, targeting remote areas where disappearances went unnoticed. Avery quit the job soon after, the solitude no longer comforting but a siren call for trouble. The forest, once a refuge, now felt like a predator's lair, its shadows hiding truths too dark to face alone. The stories of Samuel Hyo, Grant Calloway, and Avery Drayton are not isolated nightmares but threads in a larger tapestry of terror woven through America's wild places. The Gila's Bunker, Burnt Hollow's Hunter, Tioga's Killers, each reveals a wilderness alive with malice, human and otherwise. The evidence is undeniable. A hatch leading to barrels of severed limbs, a campsite littered with human bones, a grave hiding the remains of the forgotten, footprints too large for men, journals detailing atrocities, knives and ropes meant for slaughter. These are the relics of a darkness that does not sleep. Official reports dismiss them as accidents or misinterpretations, but the men who lived these horrors know better. Carlton Dufus and Lars Mikkelsen remain shadows in the wild, their names whispered in fear by those who know the truth. The wilderness is not ours. It belongs to what we cannot name, to forces that watch from the treeline, waiting for the moment we stray too far. What would you do, reader, alone in a tower with only a rifle and a flickering lantern, when footsteps climb the stairs at midnight? Could you face the darkness beyond the glass, knowing what might stare back? Share your thoughts below, and subscribe to The Forbidden Excavation for more true horrors unearthed from the places we dare not tread.